The parking lot was empty except for my car, and the kind of darkness that makes you feel like the last person left on Earth. I had counted 17 trucks passing on the highway since my son-in-law's taillights disappeared around the bend, and I had stopped counting after that because counting made the waiting feel worse. The heater had given out 20 minutes into the drive, and now the cold had found its way through the door seams and the floorboards and the place where the window seal had been cracking since last winter. I kept telling myself he was coming back. Parents tell themselves a lot of things that aren't true. I want to explain something before I tell you the rest of this. I am not a foolish woman. I taught 8th grade English for 31 years. I raised 2 daughters largely on my own after my husband passed, and I did it without losing the house or my mind, which is more than a lot of people can say. I know when a paragraph is going somewhere, and I know when a story is lying to me. I just didn't want to believe that the story my own family was telling me was one of those lies. My name is Dorothy, and I am 64 years old, and I am going to tell you how I almost signed away everything I had left in this world. My youngest daughter had always been the one I worried about. Not because she was never bad, but because she had a tendency to find people who were. In high school, it was the boy who borrowed her car and drove it into a ditch. In college, it was the roommate who stole her financial aid checks. And then, at 27, it was my son-in-law. He had a salesman's face. That's the only way I know to describe it. The kind of face that seems warm until you realize the warmth is calculated, like a lamp someone turned on specifically so you'd stop noticing the shadows. He shook my hand at their first dinner together and called me ma'am, and my daughter looked at him the way she used to look at things she was afraid might disappear. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself my daughter had earned the right to make her own choices. They married 2 years later in my backyard under the oak tree my husband had planted the year my oldest was born. It was a beautiful wedding. I paid for most of it. That was the first check. It would not be the last. In the beginning, the requests were small enough to feel reasonable. A loan to cover a slow month at his business, which was some kind of consulting arrangement he was never particularly specific about. A little help with the down payment on their house, because the market was so difficult, and wasn't it better for them to build equity than throw money at rent? My daughter would call me on a Sunday evening, and her voice would have that particular quality, too casual, too light, like she was trying to keep something balanced, and I would know before she finished her sentence what she was about to ask. I said yes almost every time. I know how that sounds. But here is what I need you to understand about being a mother. You don't stop. Even when your children are grown and married and supposed to be building their own lives, some part of you is still standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m. waiting to hear the front door. Some part of you will always be waiting. And when they come to you, that part of you doesn't stop to calculate the interest or check the balance or ask the questions a sensible banker would ask. It just opens. I had a financial advisor named Gerald, who had been managing my retirement account since before my husband died. He called me in the spring of the year my daughter turned 33, and he said, "Dorothy, I need to ask you about some of these withdrawals." And his voice had that careful quality that meant he had been thinking about this call for a while before he made it. I told him I had been helping my daughter with some things. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dorothy, in the last 4 years you've withdrawn a little over $90,000. I remember holding the phone very still against my ear. I remember looking out my kitchen window at the bird feeder my husband had built and thinking about how I needed to refill it. $90,000. I had known the number was large. I had not known it was that large. I told Gerald I would be more careful. I meant it when I said it. The trouble was that my son-in-law was careful too. He had a gift for timing, the way some people do, an instinct for when you were most tired or most lonely or most afraid of the quiet in a house where someone used to be. He would bring my daughter to Sunday dinner and be charming and help clear the table. And then sometime around dessert he would begin talking about their plans, their dreams, the future they were building, and somehow, by the time I was loading the dishwasher, I had agreed to something I hadn't fully understood I was agreeing to. The house conversation started like that. They had been in their home for 6 years by then, and according to my son-in-law, the market had shifted in ways that made their mortgage complicated. Some refinancing situation I let him explain twice without fully following, and there was an opportunity. He always called them opportunities, to simplify things by adding my name to a joint account that would help them qualify for better terms. Just paperwork, he said. Just a formality. You wouldn't be responsible for anything, Dorothy. He called me Dorothy. He had stopped calling me ma'am years ago. I told him I'd think about it. My daughter took my hand across the table and said, "Mom, it would really mean everything to us." And her eyes were the same eyes she'd had at 7 years old asking me to keep the nightlight on. And I am telling you that no amount of sensible thinking can fully defend against that. I called Gerald the next morning. He told me not to do it. He said, "Dorothy, I've seen this structure before, and it is not a formality. And if things go sideways with their finances, your name is attached to them." He used words like liability and exposure and cosigner, and his voice had the particular gentleness of someone delivering bad news they've had to deliver before. I told him I needed time. What I didn't tell Gerald was that my daughter had called me the night before after her husband had gone to sleep, and she had cried in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager. A quiet, effortful crying like she was trying to keep it contained. And she had said, "Mom, things are really hard right now, and I'm scared." And that was the moment I stopped thinking clearly. That was the moment the story my son-in-law had been writing for years finally arrived at the page he had always intended. We planned to go to the attorney's office on a Thursday. My son-in-law said it was just a signature, said he'd drive me since my car had been making a noise I hadn't gotten around to having checked, said we'd stop for lunch afterward and make a day of it. My daughter couldn't come a work obligation, she said, apologetically, over the phone the night before. I noticed something strained in her voice, but I filed it away. He picked me up at 10 in the morning. He was pleasant the whole drive, talking about the grandchildren, asking about my garden, complimenting the good weather. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the town I'd lived in for 38 years pass by outside the window, and I felt the particular unease of someone who cannot name what is wrong. We stopped at a gas station about 40 minutes outside of town. He said he needed coffee. Did I want anything? And I said no thank you, and watched him go inside. I checked my phone. There was a text from my oldest daughter. She lived in another state, and we talked every Sunday, and something about seeing her name made me feel less alone. Then I noticed we had not been heading toward the attorney's office. I had not been paying close attention, because I do not know that route well, but I knew the highway, and I knew we were heading away from town, not toward it. He came back with coffee and got behind the wheel, and I said, "I don't think we're going the right way." And he smiled and said he wanted to show me something first, a property he was considering. It wouldn't take long. I asked why we hadn't discussed this. He said he'd mentioned it and I must have forgotten. He had not mentioned it. I am 64, not 84, and I had not forgotten. We drove for another 15 minutes, and then he pulled off the highway onto a county road I did not recognize, and then off that road into a gravel lot beside a shuttered gas station, the kind of place that had probably closed in 2009 and never been anything since. There was a dumpster and some broken concrete and nothing else for as far as I could see except open fields and the highway in the distance. He turned off the car. I want to tell you about what I felt in that moment, because I don't think it was what you'd expect. It wasn't exactly fear. It was more like recognition. The way you feel when a story you've been reading finally shows you the thing it was hiding since the first paragraph. He said we needed to talk. I said I was listening. He put his coffee in the cup holder and turned to face me. And the salesman's warmth was gone, and what was underneath it was something flat and precise. He told me that the financial situation was more serious than my daughter had let on. He told me that there were debts he didn't specify the kind or the source, and that if I didn't sign the paperwork today, if I went home and talked to Gerald or thought about it too long, there were going to be consequences for my daughter that she didn't deserve. He told me that he had spoken to someone about the withdrawals over the years, and that the way things looked, on paper, it could be characterized as a gift tax situation. Or worse, if someone decided to look closely, he was threatening me with my own generosity. I looked at him for a long time. Outside the window, a plastic bag was moving across the gravel in the wind, and I watched it because it gave me something to look at that wasn't his face. Then I told him I needed some air, and I opened the door and got out. He didn't stop me. I think he expected me to stand outside for a minute and then get back in, shaken enough to cooperate. I walked to the other side of the lot, and I took out my phone, and I called 911 first. I want to be very clear about this, because I know it's the part that matters most. I called for help before I did anything else. I told the dispatcher where I was, or as close as I could determine. The highway exit number was still visible on my phone's map, and I told her I felt unsafe and needed someone to come. She was calm and kind, and she kept me on the line. While I was waiting, I called Gerald. I told him exactly where I was and exactly what had just been said to me, and I told him I needed him to do whatever could be done immediately to protect my accounts. Gerald had known me for 19 years. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He said, "I'll take care of it right now, Dorothy. You just stay safe." My son-in-law had gotten out of the car by then. He was standing about 20 feet away watching me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Something tight and calculating, like he was running numbers. He didn't know who I was calling. He called out that we should just get back in the car and talk. I turned away from him. The deputy arrived in 14 minutes. I had counted. He was young, maybe 30, and he took one look at the situation. Older woman alone in a gravel lot, off a county road with a man who was not related to her, and his hand moved to his belt in a way that was not aggressive, but was very much present. He asked me how I was doing. I told him the truth. I told him all of it, starting with the drive and the conversation and the documents sitting in a folder in the back seat. My son-in-law had a different version. He told the deputy I'd gotten confused, that I'd asked to stop, that we were just taking a break from the drive. The deputy looked at him. He looked at me. He asked if I wanted to go home. I said yes. The deputy drove me himself. My son-in-law followed behind us the whole way, and I watched his headlights in the side mirror and felt something I couldn't immediately name, something that had been very heavy for a very long time getting lighter. Gerald had already begun the process by the time I got home. He had flagged the accounts and notified the relevant parties, and he had called his contact at the estate planning firm, a woman named Patricia, who had handled my husband's affairs years ago, and left her a message marked urgent. Patricia called me that evening at 6:30. She asked me to describe everything that had been proposed. I described it. She was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was thinking carefully. Then she said, "Dorothy, I want you to come in tomorrow morning, because there are several things we need to address." And she said it with a kind of steady efficiency that made me feel, for the first time in months, like I was standing on solid ground. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in my husband's side of the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the oak tree in the backyard and the wedding and the $90,000 and the way my daughter had cried on the phone trying to keep it contained. And I kept coming back to one question. Did she know? My oldest daughter called me from her state at 10 that night because Gerald had called her when he couldn't reach me on the first try, and she was steady and angry and clear in the way she had always been, the one who handled emergencies like a person who had been practicing for them. She said, "Mom, I'm booking a flight for tomorrow morning," and I didn't argue. She landed at noon. Patricia's office was at 2. The paperwork my son-in-law had prepared was not, as he had described it, a formality. Patricia walked me through it with the patience of someone who had seen this kind of document before. It would have transferred co-ownership of my home to a joint trust with my son-in-law as co-trustee, meaning he would have had authority over decisions regarding the property. Combined with the joint account, he would have had significant access to my primary assets with limited accountability. She said the structure had the hallmarks of something designed specifically to be difficult to undo. My oldest sat beside me and held my hand and did not say "I told you so," which was more grace than I probably would have managed. We spent 2 hours in Patricia's office. By the time we left, I had begun the process of updating my estate documents completely, removing any arrangements that had been made with my son-in-law in mind, and Patricia had the name of a colleague who handled elder financial abuse cases. She said that word abuse with a careful neutrality, not to shock me, just to name the thing correctly. The thing about naming something correctly is that it changes what you're allowed to feel about it. My daughter called me that night. Not the oldest, the one who was married to him. She called from a number I didn't recognize, which told me she was somewhere other than home. Her voice was different than it had been in months. The performance of lightness was gone. What was left sounded exhausted in a way that comes from holding something difficult for a very long time. She said, "Mom, I need to tell you some things." I said, "I'm listening." It took her 40 minutes. The debts were from gambling, not hers, his. It had started before they were married and never stopped, she said, only changed shape. There had been people he owed money to, the kind of people she was afraid to describe in detail. He had told her that if she helped him access my assets, the problem would go away, and he had convinced her that it would cost me very little, a signature, a formality. She wouldn't even have to know the full picture. He had spent 3 years convincing her that what he was planning was a reasonable solution to an impossible situation. She had almost believed him. I think part of her had believed him completely. I sat on the back porch while she talked. The oak tree was dark against the sky, and the bird feeder was full because I had refilled it that afternoon, which had felt, at the time, like the only thing I knew how to do. I told her I loved her. I meant it. I also told her I could not have her husband in my home or in my finances again, and that if she needed help, real help, the kind that involved an attorney and a safe place to go, I would give her that without question. I told her that being her mother did not require me to make myself a casualty. I had spent 31 years teaching 8th graders the difference between a story with integrity and a story that was just trying to manipulate you into accepting a bad ending. I knew which kind this had been trying to be, she cried. This time she didn't try to keep it contained. I sat on the back porch in the October cold and listened to my daughter cry, and I cried too. And the oak tree stood where it always had in the dark. The weeks that followed were not simple. Things like this are never simple. And I want to be honest about that because I think there's something dishonest in stories that resolve too cleanly. My daughter did not leave him immediately. She went to her mother-in-law's house for a week, and then she went back. And then she came to stay with me for 10 days. And then there were lawyers involved, and it was messy in the way that real things are messy. My oldest flew back twice. Gerald updated my accounts and documented everything. Patricia's colleague reviewed the evidence and told me I had grounds for a civil case, and I told him I would think about it. What I want to tell you is not how the legal situation resolved. I want to tell you about the morning, about 3 weeks after all of this, when I drove out to that shuttered gas station alone. I don't entirely know why I went. I had thought about it for days, and I couldn't fully explain the impulse, except that there was something unfinished about the place in my mind. I parked in the same gravel lot and got out and stood in the wind, and I looked at the broken concrete and the dumpster and the highway in the distance. It was an ugly, unremarkable place. The kind of place designed to be forgotten. I had not been forgotten. I had made a phone call, and then another phone call, and I had stood on this gravel and watched the deputy's car come around the corner, and I was standing here still. I thought about my husband, who had been a quiet man with good judgment, and who had died before he could see any of this. I thought about what he would have said, and I decided he would not have said much. He was not a man who said much, but he would have put his hand on my shoulder with a particular steadiness that meant, I see you, and you are all right. I am 64 years old. I taught other people's children how to read stories critically for 3 decades. I loved a daughter so completely that I let the love become a kind of blindness, and I sat in a cold car in a gravel lot, and I made the right phone call. I want to be clear about the lesson, because I spent a long time resisting it. Loving your children does not mean making yourself available to be taken. There is a version of maternal love that our culture tells us is noble, sacrifice everything, keep nothing back, make yourself smaller so they can be larger, and I believed in that version for a long time. I no longer do. You can love someone completely and still protect yourself. You can hold the door open and still know where the lock is. My daughter has a therapist now. My son-in-law is no longer her husband. Not officially, not yet, but the process is underway. The grandchildren come to my house on Saturdays, and we bake things and watch movies, and they fall asleep on the couch the way children do, with a totality that is one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen. Gerald refills my bird feeder every time he comes over for coffee, which he does the first Sunday of every month now, because it turns out that is the kind of friendship you build when someone hears the words $90,000 and calls you back in 12 minutes. Patricia's colleague says the civil case is straightforward. I haven't decided yet. The oak tree is still there. It was there when my husband planted it, and it was there through the wedding, and it was there through all of it, and it is still there. And some mornings I stand at the kitchen window and I look at it, and I think about the things that stay. I am still here too. I thought you should know that.